Our mission today is basically to distill the core principles of Mudarabah, understand its unique structure, and maybe uncover some of those surprising details that make it so distinct. You should walk away with a really clear grasp of how this, well, centuries-old model operates, and maybe even see how its principles echo in modern partnerships.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's start at the very beginning, the foundational idea. At its simplest, what is Mudarabah?
Okay, fundamentally, it's a partnership in profit. You have one party, known as the Rab al-Mal. Think of them as the capital provider, the investor. They put up the money. And then you have the other party, the Mudarib. That's the managing partner, the expert, the one who provides the work, the effort.
So it's a direct combination of financial backing and, entrepreneurial drive.
Exactly. Think of it as uniting the financier with the innovator, the person with the idea or the skill. This isn't just about lending money and getting it back with interest. It's about combining these distinct resources, capital, and effort to create something new, and then sharing in the actual outcome.
Okay, so how does a relationship like this, one based so much on trust, how does it even begin? What does the source say?
Well, it often kicks off with something like a general memorandum of understanding, an MOU.
Ah, okay. Not the final contract yet.
No, not usually the full detailed contract. It's more like setting the overarching rules, the framework. It might outline a general agreement for financing, maybe within certain limits, an amount, a time frame, and then this MOU sort of becomes part of any more specific Mudarabah contracts that follow later. It provides the context.
Right. And what about the capital itself? Are there rules about what that looks like?
Oh, definitely. Very clear rules, actually, to avoid ambiguity. Primarily, the capital should be cash. That's the simplest.
Makes sense.
However, it's actually permissible for the capital to be in the form of goods or assets, but there's a condition.
Which is?
Their value has to be clearly agreed upon by both parties or assessed by an expert right at the time the contract begins, no guesswork later. And the amount and the description of this capital, whether cash or goods, must be absolutely clear and known.
Okay. Clear and known. What else?
Now, here's a really crucial point, something that stops Mudarabah from just being a disguised loan. The capital cannot be a debt that the Mudarib, the manager, already owes to the Rab al-Mal, the investor.
So you can't just relabel an existing debt as Mudarabah capital.
Exactly. It has to be fresh capital for this venture. And finally, the Rab al-Mal must actually deliver the capital, or at least empower the Mudarib to start using it, give them control.
This whole setup, it really starts to diverge from, say, traditional finance when we look at the Mudarib's actual role.
Yeah.
It's not just about repayment, like you said. Mudarib is expected to actively work with that capital. How does that change things, their responsibility?
That's where this concept of Yad Amana comes in. It translates roughly as the hand of trust. It's absolutely central.
Hand of trust. Okay. What does that mean practically?
It means, and this might surprise you, the Mudarib, the managing partner, they only bear responsibility or guarantee the capital if they mess up.
Mess up how?
If they're found to have acted improperly, specifically things like transgression going beyond agreed limits or negligence, carelessness, or a clear violation of the contract-specific conditions.
So if the business just fails due to market conditions, the Mudarib isn't personally liable for the lost capital.
Generally, no. Not unless their actions, their negligence or transgression, cause that loss. This is a huge difference from a traditional loan where the borrower owes the money back pretty much no matter what. It really emphasizes trust and good faith management over collateral.
Wow, okay. That level of trust must imply different levels of freedom then, right? Does the Rab al-Mal just hand over the money and hope for the best, or can they set limits?
They can definitely set limits. That's where we see two main types or flavors of Mudarabah. First, there's absolute Mudarabah, or mutlaka. Here, the Rab al-Mal gives the Mudarib really broad discretionary power. It's based heavily on that trust we talked about. The Mudarib operates with wide authority, but, and this is important, they must always act in the venture's best interest and follow the prevailing customs, the norms of that particular business or industry.
Okay, so wide freedom, but still within ethical and customary bounds. What's the other type?
The other is restricted Mudarabah, or muqayyada. Here, the Mudarib's actions are limited by specific conditions set by the Rab al-Mal.
Like what sort of conditions?
It could be, say, restricting the investment to a specific field, like real estate only, or a particular geographic location, or maybe only dealing in certain types of goods.
But presumably the restrictions can't be impossible.
Exactly. The source is clear. These restrictions cannot be so severe that they actually prevent the Mudarib from doing their job, from performing the work required. That would defeat the purpose.
Right. So regardless of whether it's absolute or restricted, What powers does the Mudarib generally have? What are they supposed to be doing?
Well, their core job is to strive to achieve the Mudarabah's goals, to act like any, astute, prudent investor would within the limits of the capital they have and their own expertise. That includes choosing appropriate times and places for investments, safeguarding the funds, maybe depositing them with a trusted third party, a custodian, or things like that.
Can they do things like buy or sell on credit?
They can, but typically only with the Rab al Mal's explicit permission. That's usually a key control point for the capital provider. And they also have flexibility in how they work. They can manage things directly, or they can delegate some tasks if it makes sense for the business.
So the Rab al-Mal provides the capital and sets broad strokes, maybe some restrictions, but they can't really micromanage day-to-day decisions.
Generally, no. Imposing conditions that completely strip the Mudarab of decision-making power, or demanding constant consultation on every tiny detail that goes against the spirit of Mudarabah as a partnership of trust and expertise.
Okay, that makes sense. What about compensation for the Mudarib then? We know they share in the profit, but do they get any kind of salary or wage for their effort?
That's another really key distinction. Generally speaking, the Mudarib is not entitled to wages or a salary for the work they perform as part of their core Mudarabah duties.
Why not?
Because their compensation is supposed to come from their agreed-upon share of the profit. That aligns their interests directly with the success of the venture. Taking a salary could potentially misalign those incentives.
Are there any exceptions?
Yes, a couple of specific limited ones mentioned in the standard. For instance, let's say the Mudarib needs to hire someone for a specific Mudarabah task, maybe an assistant or something. If the Mudarib pays that person out of their own pocket, not the Mudarabah funds, they can be compensated for that specific cost. Also, if the Mudarib performs work that is clearly outside their agreed-upon Mudarabah duties, maybe some unrelated consulting for the Rab al-Mal, they could potentially get a customary wage for that specific work. But it has to be under a separate agreement and paid from the Mudarabah capital, clearly demarcated.
Interesting. So very specific circumstances. What about things the Mudarib can't do? Are there prohibitions?
Absolutely. Without getting specific permission from the Rab al-Mal, the Mudarib is generally prohibited from doing things that could harm the capital or the venture. Things like abandoning the project, transferring the Mudarabah assets improperly, donating funds, lending the Mudarabah capital out to others, or just waiving rights the venture is owed.
Makes sense, protecting the investment.
Right. And also, they generally can't sell assets significantly below market price or buy assets significantly above market price, unless there's a very clear, demonstrable benefit to the Mudarabah venture in doing so. It's all about acting prudently and in good faith.
Okay, this brings us, I think, to the absolute core of any investment, profit and loss. How exactly is that handled in Mudarabah, especially with this unique trust dynamic we've been discussing?
Right. The bottom line, for profit, the rule is very clear. It must be shared based on a specified percentage of the actual profit realized, not a fixed amount.
A percentage, okay. Like 50-50 or 60-40.
Exactly. Whatever ratio they agree on, 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, it has to be agreed upon right when the contract is made.
Can they change that ratio later?
Yes. The standard says the ratio can be adjusted later on, but only by mutual agreement of both parties. Now, here's a point that really cuts to the heart of Mudarabah's principles. It's fascinatingly strict.
Oh, what's that?
If they try to stipulate a fixed lump sum amount of profit for either party, say, the Mudarib is guaranteed $5,000 profit regardless of the outcome, or the Rab al-Mal is guaranteed $10,000, the contract is considered void, or fasadat in Arabic.
Void. Just like that, why so strict?
Because Mudarabah fundamentally isn't about guaranteed returns like a loan. It's about sharing in the actual uncertain outcome of a business venture. Guaranteeing a fixed profit breaks that principle of shared risk and reward. It starts to look like interest, which is prohibited.
That's a huge difference. What if they just forget to specify the profit ratio?
If they don't specify the profit ratio at all, and there's no prevailing local custom that dictates a standard split for such ventures, then the contract is also considered void in terms of profit sharing.
So what happens then?
In that case, the Mudarib doesn't get a profit share. They're only entitled to receive a customary wage, basically, fair pay for the work they actually performed, not a share of any profit generated.
Wow. Okay, so getting that profit share ratio right at the start is critical. What about when profits are distributed?
Another key principle. Profits are generally only distributed after the original capital has been secured or recovered. They call this salam araz al-mal, basically, ensuring the safety of the capital.
So the investor gets their initial investment back first, Then profits are shared.
Essentially, yes, or at least the profit calculation is net of ensuring the capital is intact. And very importantly, any losses incurred in one period are always offset by profits earned in a subsequent period before any profit distribution happens. You have to make up for losses first.
Okay, so let me recap the loss side then. If I understood it correctly earlier, the Rab al Mal, the capital provider, they bear the financial risk. The loss of capital is on them.
Correct.
Unless the Mudarib, the manager, was negligent or broke the rules or acted improperly.
Precisely. For financial losses, the Mudarib does not bear those losses directly from their own pocket unless and only unless those losses are proven to be due to their transgression, their negligence, or a violation of the agreed-upon conditions.
So if the venture doesn't make money, revenues only cover expenses.
Then the capital, whatever is left of it, simply returns to the Rab al Mal. The Mudarib, in that case, receives no profit for their effort. They risked their time and labor, while the Rab al Mal risked their capital.
It really highlights that manager of trust role for the Mudarib.
It absolutely does.
Okay, that makes sense. But thinking about the profit side again, when does that profit share actually become, like, truly theirs, finalized? Is it as soon as money comes in?
Good question. Profit is technically considered earned or accrued as it appears as the venture becomes profitable, but it's stability or finality when it's truly locked in and distributable after ensuring capital safety that happens upon something called tenadid.
Tenadid? What's that exactly?
Think of it as the final settlement or liquidation point for a given period, or for the whole venture. It's the moment you definitively calculate the net profit after accounting for everything, ensuring the initial capital is safe or recovered. This tanadid can happen in two ways. There's real tanadid, which involves actual liquidation, selling assets, collecting debts, turning things into cash. Or there's constructive tanadid, which is more like a valuation exercise. You assess the fair value of all the Mudarabah assets and debts at a specific point in time without necessarily selling everything off. This allows for profit calculation and potential distribution even if the venture is ongoing.
Okay, and is it common to distribute profits before that final tanadid?
Yes, the standard says it's permissible to distribute profits under account, essentially, making interim distributions or advances based on apparent profits. But these are always subject to reconciliation at the final tanadid. If it turns out the final profit was less, adjustments might be needed.
That sounds like it requires some careful accounting, especially that constructive valuation.
It certainly does, and the standard adds a specific detail here for real tanadid involving debts. When you're valuing debtor accounts, you measure them by their expected recovery value after deducting any doubtful debts.
So, realistically, what you think you'll get back.
Exactly. And importantly, it notes that things like applying interest rates or discounting future cash flows based on present value concepts are not used in measuring these debtor accounts in Mudarabah valuation.
Interesting. Okay, what about a practical scenario? What if the Mudarib decides to mix some of their own money into the Mudarabah venture? Is that allowed? How does it affect profit sharing?
That's a great question, and yes, it can happen. If the Mudarib mixes their own funds with the Mudarabah capital, with permission of course, they effectively wear two hats. They become a partner regarding their own capital contribution, and they remain a Mudarib for the capital provided by the Rab al Mal.
So how is the profit divided then?
The total profit generated by the mixed funds is first allocated based on the proportion of capital. The Mudarib takes the profit corresponding to their own capital share. Then, the remaining profit, the portion attributable to the Rab al Mal's capital, is divided between the Mudarib and the Rab al Mal according to the originally agreed Mudarabah profit-sharing ratio.
Right, so it's a two-step process. Makes sense. And just circling back quickly to safeguards, what about guarantees? Can the Rab al Mal ask for some kind of guarantee on their capital?
Guarantees are permissible to include in a Mudarabah contract. However, and this echoes the point about liability, such a guarantee can only be executed or called upon if transgression, negligence, or violation of the contract conditions by the Mudarib is definitively proven. It's not an unconditional guarantee like in a conventional loan.
Got it. Always comes back to that element of fault or misconduct by the Mudarib.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've covered how it starts, how it operates, how profit and loss work. What about the end? Every partnership concludes eventually. How does the Mudarabah terminate?
There are several ways a Mudarabah can end, according to the standard. The default is that it's terminable unilaterally by either party, the Rab al Mal or the Mudarib, can decide to end it.
Just like that. At any time.
Well, there's a catch. If the Mudarib has already started the work, actually begun using the capital and operating the venture, the contract effectively becomes binding, at least until the next tanadid or liquidation point. You can't just pull the plug mid-operation without settling things.
Okay, that makes practical sense. What else?
It can also be terminated by mutual agreement, obviously. Both parties decide together it's time to wrap up. If they agreed on a specific fixed term for the Mudarabah right at the beginning, say a 2-year venture, then it naturally terminates when that term expires.
And if it has a fixed term, can one party still end it early?
If a fixed term was agreed upon, the standard indicates it generally can only be terminated before that term ends by mutual consent. The fixed term makes it more binding. Other causes for termination would be things like the total loss or destruction of the Mudarab capital, nothing left to manage. Or, if the Mudarab is an entity, it's liquidation or dissolution. Or the death of the Mudarab, if they are an individual whose specific skills were key.
Okay. And regardless of how it ends, mutual agreement, term expiring, loss of capital, what's always the final step?
The final step is always its tinadid, that liquidation and settlement process. You have to finalize the accounts, determine the final state of the capital, calculate the final profit or loss, and distribute whatever is due to each party according to the rules. It's the necessary closing of the books.
Right, the final reckoning. So after digging into all this, what does it really mean for you listening? We've seen Mudarabah isn't just, another financial contract. It feels more like a framework really built on profound trust. There's shared risk, but it's allocated very specifically risk of profit for both, but risk of capital loss primarily on the Rab al-Mal unless the Mudarab messes up. And the rules are so clearly distinct, it's quite different from a standard loan or even basic equity.
Yeah, and I think that raises a really important question for today's world. We live in an era of incredibly complex, sometimes opaque financial instruments. And the relative simplicity, the ethical underpinnings of Mudarabah, especially that focus on the Mudarab's hand of trust, the detailed rules about actual profit, not guaranteed returns it offers, perhaps a compelling alternative model, one that seems to emphasize the real economy, real effort over just financial speculation.
Absolutely. From the nitty-gritty of how capital needs to be defined, that it can't be existing debt, to that really fascinating fasadat rule, the voiding of the contract if you try to guarantee a fixed profit. This deep dive has definitely shown us a different way of thinking about investment and partnership.
So maybe a final thought for you to consider as you process all this. Think about those strict conditions for when the Mudarib is actually liable for capital loss only for transgression, negligence, or violating the contract. How does that specific allocation of risk fundamentally shift the dynamics compared to a traditional loan where repayment is paramount, or even a standard equity investment where all shareholders might bear losses proportionally? What implications could this unique emphasis on proven misconduct, on trust and good faith, have for transparency and accountability in business ventures? Maybe even in partnerships outside the specific realm of Islamic finance. Something to mull over.